"I lost my husband today. Please give me shelter tonight," begged the native woman to the lonely cowboy. The sun was dipping low behind the distant hills, turning the wide prairie into a sea of gold and orange. Daniel Mercer, a cowboy who had spent most of his life wandering the open land, he had built it himself, stone by stone, and though it was modest, it gave him comfort. Daniel had lived alone for many years. His family had been gone for a long time, taken by sickness when he was still a young man. Since then, he had kept himself apart from people, finding solace in the quiet and the vast, empty land stretching beyond his cabin. The prairie had a kind of honesty Daniel respected. The wind moved freely, the grass swayed in waves, and there was no need for words or explanations. The only companions he had were the horses in his stable, the soft creaking of the barn, and the occasional distant howl of a coyote at night. He liked it this way. Life was simple, predictable, and safe. As he finished brushing down his horse, Daniel noticed the clouds beginning to gather in the sky. They were dark and heavy, moving faster than the usual evening breeze. A storm was coming, he realized, and it would arrive sooner than expected. He began to move quickly, securing tools in the shed, bringing firewood inside, and checking the windows of his small cabin. The air had that strange electric feel that always came just before rain and thunder. It was at that moment that Daniel saw her. A small figure moving across the field, coming toward him. At first he thought his tired eyes were playing tricks. He squinted into the fading light, but there was no mistaking it. A woman, walking slowly and unsteadily, was making her way toward the ranch. She was cloaked in a simple dress, dusty and worn from travel, and her shoulders were bent as if the weight of the world rested upon them. Daniel's hand instinctively went to the handle of his knife. He had lived long enough to know the dangers of strangers wandering alone in these parts. Travelers were often desperate, sometimes dangerous, and at other times simply unlucky. He had seen men and women struggle against storms, hunger, and sickness, but something about her stopped him from calling out immediately. As she drew closer, he could see the exhaustion etched into her face. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear and pain. She seemed almost afraid to take another step, as if her body might give out at any moment. Daniel's first instinct was caution. He had to protect himself. Yet underneath that caution, something stirred in him, a mixture of curiosity, concern, and a faint recognition of grief. When she finally reached his porch, she stumbled slightly. Daniel rushed to steady her. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked cheeks, and in a trembling voice whispered, I lost my husband today. Please give me shelter tonight." Daniel froze. The words struck him harder than he expected. In that simple plea, he could hear the depth of her despair, the rawness of loss. He remembered his own losses, the nights spent alone in the dark after his family had passed. He remembered the cold silence of the cabin when no one was there to share the grief, the emptiness that pressed in from all sides. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Daniel looked at her again, taking in the small, fragile figure shivering on his porch. He weighed his options. He could send her away. It would be safer. He had lived alone for years, avoiding trouble, avoiding people. Keeping strangers away was a habit he had perfected. But he couldn't. Not this time. He could see the hopelessness in her eyes, the fear of being alone in the storm, the weight of the day she had endured. The thought of her wandering out into the night, exposed to the wind and rain, was unbearable. Against his instincts, against years of habit, he stepped forward. "Come inside," he said quietly, holding out his hand. "You can stay by the fire. You'll be safe here." Paroleless, her relief was immediate and palpable. She nodded quickly, almost unable to speak, and let him guide her into the cabin. Inside, the warmth hit her, and she wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the fire Daniel had started earlier. He handed her a blanket and a cup of warm water. She accepted it with trembling hands, taking small, careful sips. Daniel studied her quietly as she drank. She seemed so small and fragile, yet there was a strength in her posture, even in exhaustion. Her eyes were dark and bright at the same time, filled with pain but also with life. Something about her presence stirred memories in Daniel. Memories of laughter, of voices he had loved and lost, of hands held in comfort during times of sorrow. She introduced herself slowly, her voice soft and uncertain. "My name is Ayana," she said. We were traveling west. My husband, he was hurt. He didn't make it." She paused, struggling to find the words to explain the depth of her loss. Daniel did not interrupt. He simply nodded, letting her speak. Sometimes the greatest comfort came not from words, but from being heard. She told him about the journey she and her husband had undertaken. They had been trying to find a safer place after their community had been forced to relocate. The land they had left behind was no longer safe, and they had hoped for a fresh start. But illness and accident had struck, leaving her alone. She had buried him herself, unable to go on without giving him a proper farewell. And now, with the storm coming and no one to help her, she had no place to turn. Daniel listened quietly. Each word she spoke painted a picture of hardship and loss. He could feel the weight of her story pressing against him, a reminder that life could be cruel and sudden. And yet, in her eyes, he saw something else. Determination, resilience, a desire to survive. It was a spark that he had almost forgotten existed in the world. As the storm began in earnest, with wind whipping against the walls and rain pelting the roof, Daniel made her comfortable near the fire. He brought her more blankets and sat across from her, keeping watch. Neither of them spoke much after that. The crackle of the fire and the rhythm of the rain on the roof filled the cabin. There was a quiet understanding between them, a shared recognition of loss, of fear, and of the need for safety. Daniel's mind wandered to his past, to the nights he had spent alone, the nights when grief had been a silent companion in the dark. He remembered the emptiness, the loneliness, and the cold that could not be chased away by fire alone. Seeing Ayana now, he realized that perhaps, in helping her, he was also helping himself. Not by erasing his pain, but by acknowledging it, by sharing it in a small, human way. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, a fragile warmth had taken hold. Ayana sat quietly, staring into the fire, lost in her memories and sorrow. Daniel remained vigilant, but he did not feel the usual anxiety that came with strangers. There was a sense of purpose, of rightness, in offering shelter to someone in need. By the time the wind died down and the rain lessened to a gentle patter, Daniel realized he had not felt this connection in years. For the first time since he had been left alone, he felt the stirrings of hope, of companionship, even in the midst of sorrow. He understood, in that quiet, stormy night, that the world could still offer moments of grace. And as he finally allowed himself a moment of rest, watching Ayana sleep quietly under the blankets, Daniel knew that this encounter, brief, unexpected, and born of tragedy, would change something inside him. The prairie outside was still wide and empty, but the cabin now held a new presence, a new story, and perhaps a new beginning. Morning light crept slowly through the small windows of Daniel's cabin, casting soft golden beams onto the wooden floor. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside wet, fresh, and glimmering with tiny droplets of rain on every leaf and blade of grass. Inside, the cabin was warm and quiet. The fire had burned low overnight, but its gentle glow still filled the room. Ayana was awake now, sitting quietly near the hearth, wrapped in the blankets Daniel had given her. Her eyes were red from crying, and her hands shook slightly as she held a cup of warm tea he had prepared. Daniel watched her from across the room. There was a quiet dignity in her presence, even in the midst of grief. He had offered shelter because it was the right thing to do, but as he looked at her now, he realized there was so much more to her story, a story that he wanted in some small way to understand. Ayana took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying the weight of sorrow without faltering. She explained how she and her husband had been traveling west, seeking a safer place for themselves and their community. There had been danger in their homeland, threats from those who did not understand or accept them. Her husband had believed that moving farther west would give them peace, a place to live without fear. But the journey had been harder than she had imagined. The days were long, the nights cold, and the paths treacherous. Her husband had fallen ill after a long day of travel, and there had been no way to care for him properly. By the time the group they were with could stop to help, it was too late. He had passed quietly, leaving Ayana alone in the world. She had buried him herself, digging a small grave in the earth with trembling hands. She had spoken words of love and farewell, hoping that somewhere he could hear her. As she spoke, Daniel listened without interruption. He had learned long ago that sometimes the best thing to do was simply to be present, to offer silent support. He did not offer words of comfort or sympathy because he knew that nothing could ease her pain at that moment. Instead, he handed her more tea and let the silence fill the spaces between her words. When she finished her story, there was a long pause. The two of them sat quietly, listening to the gentle crackle of the fire and the occasional drip of water from the roof. Ayana's face was pale but resolute, and Daniel could see that beneath the sorrow there was a spark of determination. She had survived the storm outside and the storm within her heart. She had faced death and loss, yet she had come this far seeking nothing but safety for the night. "Thank you," she said softly, finally breaking the silence. "I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't found you." "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "Everyone deserves shelter when the storm comes." His words were simple, but they carried a sincerity that could not be questioned. As the morning passed, Daniel and Ayanna began to settle into a rhythm. She helped him around the cabin, performing small tasks with careful attention. She gathered firewood, cleaned the dishes, and even helped feed the horses in the stable. Her movements were deliberate and precise, showing the familiarity with the land that Daniel found surprising. It was clear that she had grown up learning how to survive, how to make do with what was available, and how to respect the rhythms of nature. In return, Daniel offered what he could. He showed her how to tend the small garden outside, how to check the fences for damage, and how to care for the animals in a way that would keep them healthy through the changing seasons. Though he was used to living alone, he found that having someone to share the work made the tasks lighter, more manageable. For the first time in years, the cabin felt alive with presence and movement. As the day wore on, they spoke more about their lives. Daniel shared fragments of his own past, stories of a family lost too soon, of nights spent in silence and loneliness, and of the hard lessons he had learned on the prairie. Ayanna listened intently, nodding occasionally and sometimes offering quiet words of understanding. Though their experiences were different, they shared a common thread: loss. Both had been forced to navigate the world alone, and both had learned to survive in ways that required strength, patience, and resilience. Despite the sorrow in their stories, there was also laughter. Small moments of humor and surprise crept into their conversations, breaking the heaviness of grief. Ayanna had a quick wit that shone through even in her sadness, and Daniel found himself smiling more than he had in years. He realized that human connection, even brief and fragile, had the power to heal in ways he had long forgotten. As the afternoon sunlight filtered through the cabin windows, Daniel began to notice the world outside with new eyes. The storm had washed the land clean, leaving the grass sparkling and the air crisp and fresh. Birds had returned, singing softly, and the distant hills glowed in the warm light. It was as if the earth itself had been renewed, and in that renewal Daniel saw a reflection of the small but significant renewal happening within the cabin. Ayanna, too, seemed to find solace in the simple rhythms of the day. She moved with purpose, tending to the animals and the garden, her grief softened by the physical labor and the quiet companionship. She spoke of her husband often, not with despair, but with respect and memory. Each story she shared was a way of keeping his presence alive, of honoring the life they had shared. As evening approached, the cabin took on a warm, golden glow. The fire burned brightly, and the small space was filled with the comforting scent of burning wood and the quiet sounds of domestic life. Outside, the sky was clear, and the first stars began to appear, twinkling like tiny beacons of hope. Daniel and Ayanna sat near the fire, reflecting on the day and the journey that had brought them together. For Daniel, the experience was transformative. He had spent so long avoiding others, fearing connection and hiding from the pain of the past. Yet in opening his home to Ayanna, he had discovered something profound. The act of giving, of offering shelter and care, could also bring healing. It reminded him that life, though unpredictable and often harsh, still held moments of grace and kindness. Ayanna, too, felt a subtle shift within herself. She had arrived at the cabin with a heart weighed down by loss, uncertain and vulnerable. Yet in the safety and warmth of Daniel's presence, she found a sense of stability and trust. She realized that even in the midst of grief there could be moments of comfort, and that human connection, however fleeting, could provide a lifeline in dark times. As night fell, the cabin became a sanctuary. The storm was long gone, replaced by the calm of the prairie night. The fire crackled softly, and the world outside was quiet, peaceful, and still. Daniel and Ayanna sat together in companionable silence, each lost in their thoughts but comforted by the presence of the other. By the end of the day, a fragile sense of hope had begun to take root. They both understood that the journey ahead would not be easy, that there would be challenges and obstacles, but for the first time in a long while they felt less alone. The simple act of shelter, of sharing warmth and safety, had created a bond that transcended words. And in that quiet, intimate space, the beginnings of trust and understanding had formed. Both Daniel and Ayanna realized that sometimes the smallest gestures, a cup of tea, a blanket, a listening ear, could change the course of a life. In helping each other survive the storm, They had found something unexpected, the possibility of renewal, the chance to carry forward with courage and hope, and the quiet knowledge that even in the darkest times, human kindness could shine as brightly as the morning sun. The morning sun shone brightly over the prairie, warming the cabin and casting long shadows across the wooden floor. After the storm had passed, the world outside seemed renewed. Drops of rain still clung to the grass and the leaves, sparkling like tiny diamonds, and the distant hills glowed with a soft golden light. Inside the cabin, the air was calm, but there was an unspoken tension that neither Daniel nor Ayana ignored. Both were aware of the fragility of this moment. The quiet peace could easily be broken by the arrival of others, by the whispers of judgment from the outside world. Ayana had grown accustomed to the routines of survival, but Daniel noticed something new in her movements. She worked with a quiet determination, tending to the cabin chores with care, repairing small things, and checking the horses' stalls. Her hands were skilled and confident, and it became clear to Daniel that she was no stranger to hard work. She had learned from her family and her people how to survive and thrive in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving. Daniel himself had been surprised by how much easier his tasks became with her help. For years he had done everything alone, mending fences, tending the garden, feeding the animals, and maintaining the cabin. The work had been repetitive and lonely, and even though he had grown accustomed to it, he had always felt a small emptiness, a quiet longing for companionship. Watching Ayana move about the cabin, performing each task with care and skill, he felt a sense of relief he hadn't expected. The chores felt lighter, the days fuller, and the silence less heavy. As the day went on, they began to speak more openly about their lives. Daniel shared fragments of his past, speaking carefully but honestly about the family he had lost and the years of loneliness that had followed. Ayana listened attentively, her eyes soft with empathy, nodding occasionally as if she understood more than words could convey. Though their experiences were different, there was a shared understanding between them, a recognition of grief, resilience, and the quiet strength required to continue living after great loss. Ayana, in turn, spoke of her husband, describing him not only as a partner but as a companion who had shaped her life. She told Daniel about their dreams, about the small plans they had made for a peaceful life in a new place. Her words were tinged with sadness, but also with respect and love. Each story she told brought her husband back to life in some small way, allowing her to honor his memory while also acknowledging her own need to survive. Daniel was struck by her courage. Despite her grief, she moved with purpose, tending to the cabin and animals, and even helping repair the fences and tools that had grown worn over the years. She asked questions about the land, about the best ways to grow crops, and about the habits of the animals. It was clear she had a sharp mind and a deep understanding of the natural world. Her presence was not only comforting but also enlightening, reminding Daniel of the wisdom that could come from experience and observation. By mid-afternoon, the cabin had transformed into a space of quiet activity. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, filling the room with warmth and light. The smell of fresh water, damp earth, and burning wood combined to create a sense of homeliness that Daniel had almost forgotten existed. Small routines of life, sweeping the floor, tending to the horses, preparing a meal, took on new meaning when shared with another person. The companionship, though silent at times, brought a subtle joy that neither of them could ignore. Outside, the prairie was alive with the aftermath of the storm. Birds returned to the trees, singing softly, while the wind carried the fresh scent of rain across the open land. The hills and valleys seemed to glimmer, as though the earth itself had been cleansed. Daniel found himself walking to the edge of the property, looking out at the vast expanse and thinking about the changes that had occurred in such a short time. The land was the same, yet everything felt different. The storm had passed, and with it, a shift had taken place within the cabin, within themselves. Ayana joined him outside, carrying a small basket of eggs she had gathered from the henhouse. She handed them to him with a gentle smile, a small gesture of trust and appreciation. Daniel accepted them, feeling a warmth spread through him that had little to do with the sun or the fire. It was the warmth of connection, of shared understanding, and of recognition that they were no longer entirely alone in the world. They spent the rest of the day working together. Daniel showed her how to mend a fence that had been damaged by the storm, while Ayana demonstrated a careful way to plant seeds that would grow more efficiently in the rich prairie soil. They spoke intermittently, sharing stories, asking questions, and occasionally laughing at small mistakes or unexpected discoveries. The laughter was soft and rare, but it carried a profound sense of relief. Both had spent too long in silence, and now, for the first time in years, they felt the quiet joy of companionship. As evening approached, Daniel noticed a subtle change in Ayana's demeanor. She seemed less burdened by grief, though it was still present, like a shadow that followed her quietly. The routines and tasks, the shared moments of laughter and understanding, had provided a small sense of relief. She had begun to feel that the world was not entirely hostile, that there were still moments of kindness and safety, even after great loss. Daniel, too, felt a shift within himself. He had spent so long avoiding others, fearing connection, and isolating himself to avoid pain. Yet in helping Ayana, he discovered something unexpected, that giving care, offering shelter, and sharing time could bring a quiet healing. It reminded him that even in a world filled with hardship, there were moments of grace and human kindness that could restore hope and trust. The prairie was bathed in the soft light of the moon. The stars twinkled brightly, and the quiet of the evening was only interrupted by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant call of an owl. The cabin, warm and inviting, became a sanctuary not just from the storm, but from the memories of loneliness and loss. The fire crackled softly, casting gentle shadows across the walls, and the world outside seemed distant and peaceful. Daniel and Ayana sat together near the fire, each lost in thought, but comforted by the presence of the other. They spoke little, yet the silence was not heavy. It was filled with understanding, trust, and a shared recognition of the journey they had both endured. The bond between them grew not from words alone, but from the quiet moments of support, from the simple acts of care and companionship, and from the unspoken acknowledgement that they were not entirely alone in the world. By the end of the evening, a fragile hope had begun to take root in both their hearts. They understood that the journey ahead would not be without challenges, that life would continue to test their strength and resilience. Yet, for the first time in a long while, they felt a sense of possibility. The storm had passed, leaving a world renewed and fresh, and in that renewal they discovered a subtle truth, that human connection, trust, and kindness could offer shelter from even the harshest storms, both literal and emotional. Daniel realized that his life, once quiet and solitary, had begun to shift in a profound way. Ayana's presence, though temporary, had reminded him of the importance of trust, empathy, and courage. He understood that the past, with all its pain and loss, could coexist with the present, offering lessons and moments of grace. The cabin, once a place of solitude, had become a space of healing, reflection, and gentle hope. Ayana, too, recognized the change within herself. She had arrived at the cabin exhausted, grieving and unsure of what to do next. Yet, in the warmth of the fire and the presence of someone who listened and cared, she had begun to reclaim a sense of strength. It was not merely about enduring hardship, but about allowing moments of kindness and understanding to guide her forward. As they settled down for the night, Daniel and Ayana shared a quiet sense of gratitude. For Daniel, it was the gratitude of offering help and discovering the power of human connection. For Ayana, it was the gratitude of finding shelter, comfort, and understanding in a world that had seemed overwhelmingly cruel. Together, they had faced the aftermath of a storm, both the literal storm outside and the emotional storms within their hearts. The fire burned low, and the cabin was filled with the gentle sounds of the prairie night. They both knew that the coming days would bring challenges, that there were still decisions to make and paths to choose. Yet for that night they allowed themselves to rest in the quiet security of the cabin, in the warmth of shared presence, and in the knowledge that even in times of great loss, hope could emerge, subtle but enduring. By the time sleep claimed them, a silent promise lingered in the cabin. They had both discovered that even in a world filled with uncertainty and grief, there was room for connection, healing, and new beginnings. And though the prairie outside remained vast and open, the cabin had become a small, sacred place where courage, trust, and compassion could take root, slowly transforming their lives in ways neither had anticipated. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the prairie, casting long shadows across Daniel's cabin and the surrounding fields. The world outside seemed calm and beautiful, but inside, a quiet tension had begun to take root. Daniel had grown accustomed to the solitude of the prairie, where no one questioned his choices and no one demanded answers. But now, with Ayana staying at his cabin, he knew that their peaceful existence could be disrupted at any moment. He had hoped that the news of a traveling native woman seeking shelter would stay quiet, but small communities had ears everywhere. Travelers and neighbors alike often noticed even the smallest movements, and in such a sparsely populated area, word traveled quickly. Daniel knew this, and he felt a creeping worry that someone might come asking questions, or worse, making demands that could put both him and Ayana in an uncomfortable or even dangerous situation. As the day progressed, the prairie seemed alive with whispers carried on the wind. Birds called to each other from the trees, and the distant hills shimmered in the sunlight, but Daniel's thoughts were not on the beauty outside. His mind was filled with what-ifs. What if someone discovered Ayana at the cabin? What if they misunderstood the situation, as people often did? What if helping her brought trouble that he could not handle alone? His fears were realized by mid-afternoon. Dust rose on the horizon as 3 men rode toward the cabin. Their expressions were serious, hard, and unyielding. Daniel recognized them as men from the nearby town, people he had seen only occasionally but whose reputations were known. They were the kind of men who spoke first and asked questions later, and Daniel felt a cold knot of apprehension in his chest. The men dismounted quickly, their boots kicking up dust as they approached the cabin. "Daniel Mercer," the tallest one said, his voice sharp. "What are you doing letting that native woman stay here? Do you realize what kind of trouble this could bring?" Daniel met their gaze calmly, though his mind raced. He had spent many years avoiding conflict, avoiding confrontation, but he also knew that sending Ayana away would not be right. She was grieving, vulnerable, and alone. And though he understood their concerns, he could not turn her out into the open prairie, exposed and unprotected. "I would be so happy. She's under my roof," Daniel said evenly. "She has done no harm. She needs shelter, and I am giving it to her." The men exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. "You know people will talk," one said. "You know the rules. This could cause problems for you, for both of you." Daniel felt a surge of frustration mixed with a deep sense of resolve. For too long he had allowed fear to dictate his actions. He had lived alone, avoiding others, hiding behind the excuse of self-preservation. But now, as he looked toward Ayana, standing quietly in the cabin doorway, he felt a shift inside him. He could not let fear override compassion. Not this time. "I understand your concerns," he said firmly, "but this woman is grieving. She has nowhere else to go. I will not send her back into danger. If that causes trouble, it is a risk I am willing to take." The men muttered warnings under their breath, clearly displeased with his answer, but they did not press further. They glanced around the cabin, noting the simplicity of the life Daniel had built, and then, with a final shake of their heads, they mounted their horses and rode away. Dust rose behind them, and the sound of hooves faded into the distance. After they left, Daniel took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He knew that their visit was only a small indication of the challenges that might come. The world outside the prairie was not always kind or understanding, and he realized that his decision to protect Ayana might continue to draw attention. Yet, he also understood that this was not a choice about fear or convenience. It was a choice about right and wrong, about compassion and humanity. Ayana, who had watched the interaction silently, stepped forward. Her eyes were filled with gratitude, and her voice was soft but steady. "Thank you," she said, "for standing with me, even when it was difficult." Daniel nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him that had little to do with the sun or the fire. It was the warmth of connection, of doing the right thing despite the risks, and of realizing that sometimes courage was not about fighting others, but about standing up for someone who could not stand alone. The rest of the day was filled with quiet work. Ayana helped repair a broken fence that the storm had damaged, while Daniel tended to the animals and prepared food for the evening. Their movements were synchronized, each aware of the other's presence and efforts. There was no need for constant conversation. The silence was comfortable, a shared understanding of their circumstances and the tasks at hand. As the afternoon sun dipped low, Daniel took a moment to reflect on the changes that had occurred in such a short time. He had spent years in isolation, avoiding people and connection, believing that solitude was the only safe path. Yet now, with Ayana at his side, he realized that solitude was not always safety. True safety came from courage, from compassion, and from the willingness to face challenges alongside another person. Ayana, too, was learning from the experience. She had arrived at the cabin exhausted, grieving, and uncertain, but she had begun to see that trust could be built even in small spaces. Daniel had offered her shelter, but he had also offered her dignity and respect, allowing her to exist in the world without judgment or fear. In return, she had contributed her skills, her energy, and her quiet strength to the life of the cabin, creating a balance that neither had expected. As evening fell, the prairie was bathed in a soft golden glow. The cabin's small windows reflected the light, casting gentle patterns on the wooden floor. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, and the two of them sat together reflecting on the events of the day. The threat of judgment from the outside world had passed, but the lesson remained clear. Courage was necessary, and sometimes it required standing firm against fear, prejudice, and uncertainty. Daniel realized that he had grown in ways he had not anticipated. For years, he had believed that isolation was the key to safety, that avoiding others was the only way to protect himself from pain. But now he understood that true strength came from compassion, from taking risks for the sake of someone else, and from trusting in one's own judgment even when others disagreed. Ayanna, too, had discovered something within herself. She had faced grief, loss, and uncertainty, but she had also discovered resilience, patience, and the quiet power of human connection. She had learned that even in a world filled with fear and judgment, there were still moments of kindness, safety, and trust. And she had seen that courage was not only about survival, but about standing with others, offering and accepting help when it was most needed. The night settled over the prairie, calm and still. Stars dotted the sky, shining brightly above the cabin. The wind rustled the grass softly, and the distant hills glowed in the gentle moonlight. Inside, the fire continued to burn, providing warmth and light, a small sanctuary in the vast openness of the land. Daniel and Ayanna sat together, quiet but content, each reflecting on the day's challenges and victories. They knew that tomorrow would bring more decisions, more challenges, and possibly more scrutiny from the outside world. But for now, they allowed themselves to rest in the knowledge that they had faced adversity together and had emerged stronger. The cabin, once a place of solitude, had become a refuge, not only from the storm but from the fears and judgments of the world beyond. By the time sleep claimed them, both Daniel and Ayanna carried with them a quiet sense of pride and hope. They had stood firm in the face of judgment, protected one another, and discovered that human connection could be a powerful force for healing and courage. The events of the day had reinforced a profound truth, that shelter was more than a roof over one's head. It was the protection of dignity, the offering of trust, and the courage to face the world together. As the prairie slept under the blanket of night, the cabin remained warm and bright. Inside, two souls, each shaped by loss and hardship, had found not only safety but also understanding, compassion, and the beginnings of a bond that would guide them through the challenges ahead. And in that quiet, unassuming cabin on the edge of the prairie, Daniel and Ayanna knew that they had taken an important step toward something far greater than mere survival, toward trust, hope, and the enduring power of human kindness. The next morning dawned clear and bright over the prairie. The sky was a deep blue, and the golden sunlight spilled across the rolling hills, touching every blade of grass and sparkling on the leaves of trees that had been washed clean by the storm. Daniel woke early, as was his habit, moving quietly through the cabin so as not to disturb Ayanna, who was still asleep beneath the blankets he had given her. The fire had burned down to glowing embers overnight, leaving the cabin warm and calm. He paused for a moment, looking around the small space. It was remarkable to him how much the cabin had changed in such a short time. Once it had been a place of solitude and quiet loneliness. Now, it felt alive, filled with the presence of someone who had become a part of his daily rhythm. He realized that life had a way of surprising even the most solitary hearts, bringing connection when it was least expected. Ayanna awoke shortly after, stretching and yawning, and smiled at him. There was a sense of ease in her expression, a quiet strength that seemed to have grown over the past days. The cabin was no longer just a shelter from the storm outside. It had become a sanctuary for both of them, a place where they could rest, reflect, and begin to heal from the losses that had shaped their lives. They shared a simple breakfast together, eggs, bread, and fresh milk, while discussing the work that needed to be done on the ranch. Ayanna had quickly learned the routines, and her knowledge of the land proved invaluable. She suggested ways to plant crops more efficiently, to care for the animals with less stress, and to repair parts of the cabin that had been worn by time and weather. Daniel was impressed not only by her skill, but by her patience and attention to detail. She had turned what had once been a lonely, isolated space into a home that was both functional and comforting. As the day went on, they continued their work side by side. Daniel taught her how to mend the fences with stronger, more durable techniques. Ayanna, in turn, showed him how to water the garden and tend the soil in a way that would nourish the plants more effectively. They laughed together at small mistakes, shared observations about the land, and learned from each other's experience. It was a rhythm that neither had expected, a quiet companionship that brought joy and meaning to the hours. By afternoon, the prairie was alive with color and movement. Birds sang from the trees, insects buzzed among the flowers, and the wind carried the fresh scent of earth and growth. Daniel took a moment to look out over the land, feeling a sense of peace he had not known for years. The world was vast and open, yet the cabin, the ranch, and the small routines of life they shared had created a sense of stability, a grounding presence that he had longed for without realizing it. Ayana had grown stronger as well. Her grief, though still present, had softened into a quiet remembrance of her husband and the life they had shared. She spoke of him often, sharing stories of their travels, their dreams, and the small, tender moments that had brought them joy. Daniel listened attentively, offering a respectful silence that allowed her to honor his memory, while also beginning to focus on her own life. There was a balance between remembering and moving forward, between sorrow and hope, that neither of them had thought possible so soon. As evening approached, the two of them sat together on the small porch, watching the sun sink behind the hills. The sky was a riot of oranges, pinks, and purples, reflected in the dew-soaked grass and shimmering across the prairie. They did not speak much, allowing the beauty of the world and the quiet of each other's company to fill the space between them. There was a sense of accomplishment in their work, a satisfaction that came from shared effort and mutual respect. In the weeks that followed, Ayana and Daniel grew even closer. She helped improve the cabin and the land, planting crops, tending to the animals, and building a small garden near the edge of the property. Together they repaired fences, mended tools, and reinforced the barn. Each day brought small victories, and each night they reflected on their progress by the fire, sharing stories, laughter, and quiet moments of reflection. Ayana never intended to stay permanently. She had always planned to rejoin her community once she regained strength and found a safe path to follow. Yet, as the days passed, it became clear that the bond between them had grown stronger. Daniel had become more than a host. He was a friend, a companion, and a witness to her resilience. Likewise, Ayana had brought life, warmth, and perspective to a man who had long been isolated, teaching him that connection could bring strength rather than weakness. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned a deep shade of violet, Ayana suggested creating a small memorial garden near the edge of the property. She wanted a place to honor her husband properly, a place where his memory could live on in beauty and care. Daniel agreed, helping her dig, plant flowers, and place stones carefully to mark the small plot. Together, they built something lasting, a tribute not only to the past, but to the hope that life could continue with grace and purpose. The work brought them closer, and they spoke often of their hopes for the future. Daniel found himself sharing dreams he had long buried, ideas of improving the land, planting orchards, and perhaps even welcoming others who needed shelter and care. Ayana, too, shared her vision of a life that honored her husband's memory while embracing the possibilities that still lay ahead. In their conversations, there was a quiet understanding. They were both shaped by loss, but neither was defined by it. Spring arrived on the prairie, and with it, new growth and color. Crops sprouted, flowers bloomed, and the cabin seemed more alive than ever. The small routines of daily life, once mundane, had taken on a profound significance. Each task completed, each animal cared for, and each plant tended was a testament to resilience, cooperation, and shared humanity. Daniel and Ayana had discovered that even in the face of grief, life could hold beauty, purpose, and joy. When the time came for Ayana to continue her journey and rejoin her people, there was a quiet sadness between them. They had come to rely on each other's presence, finding comfort, understanding, and companionship in the smallest of gestures. Yet they also knew that her departure was a necessary step in her path, a choice that honored her past while embracing the possibilities of the future. On the morning of her departure, Daniel helped her gather her belongings, ensuring she had food, water, and supplies for the journey ahead. They stood together at the gate, looking out over the prairie, the wind carrying the scent of wild flowers and fresh grass. Ayana turned to him, her eyes reflecting gratitude, strength, and a quiet hope. "You gave me shelter," she said softly. Daniel shook his head gently, a small smile on his lips. "We gave each other more than that," he replied. "You brought life back to this place, and maybe I did the same for you." They shared a brief, meaningful embrace, and then Ayana mounted her horse. She rode slowly across the open land, the sun casting a warm glow over her path. Daniel watched her go, feeling a mixture of loss and hope. The cabin would be quieter now, but he knew that the bond they had formed would remain, a reminder that connection, kindness, and courage could endure even after parting. As the weeks passed, Daniel continued his work on the ranch, but the memory of Ayana's presence stayed with him. He tended to the land with renewed care, remembering the lessons she had taught him, the laughter they had shared, and the courage they had found together. The prairie, once a symbol of solitude, had become a place of possibility, hope, and enduring strength. Years later, Daniel would speak of that time with quiet reverence. He would recall the night a grieving woman knocked on his door, seeking nothing more than shelter and kindness. He would remember the storm, the challenges, and the bond they had formed. And he would tell anyone who would listen that true shelter was not just a roof over one's head. It was the courage to care, the kindness to protect, and the trust to stand beside someone when the world turned away. The prairie remained vast and open, the cabin standing small and steadfast at its edge. But within that small space, two lives had intersected, creating a story of resilience, compassion, and the quiet power of human connection. Daniel and Ayanna had faced loss and adversity, yet together they had discovered hope, understanding, and the beginning of new possibilities. And as the sun set over the rolling hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Daniel knew that life, no matter how lonely or challenging it might seem, always held the potential for change, growth, and unexpected connection. Sometimes it only took one small act of courage, one decision to offer shelter, to set in motion a chain of events that could transform lives forever.